Marshall bit one of the bandits, and Valerie, worried by his sudden actions, was unsure of what to make of the situation. Marshall explained that the war was over and that they weren't even soldiers, let alone captives. However, the bandits were unwilling to accept this, refusing to believe his words. Marshall quickly realized that all the bandits came from the northern side. One bandit, in a fit of rage, jumped on top of Marshall, accusing her people of causing the deaths of his comrades. He grabbed her by the neck, and Marshall, struggling to breathe, called out loudly for Tamex, hoping for help. Her voice echoed, but there was no answer. The bandits, thinking that no one would come to her aid, continued to threaten her. Marshall observed that the bandits were making things worse for themselves, driven by grief over the destruction of their homes and the loss of everything they had. They were determined to inflict even more harm. Their plan, as it seemed, was to sell the noblewomen in the market. The bandit who had attacked Marshall blamed her for the destruction of their homes and insisted that she remain silent as a hostage. His grip tightened on her neck, making her increasingly uncomfortable. Just then, a shoe came flying, striking the bandit in the face. The noblewomen, enraged by his violence against a defenseless woman, shouted at him. In response, Marshall took the opportunity and kicked the bandit in the groin. However, she immediately regretted it, realizing that she had likely gotten herself into deeper trouble. The bandit, now furious, was about to strike Marshall when a splash sound echoed, and the bandit fell to the ground. Sir Unvain had arrived, questioning whether the bandits were truly in the right. He extended a hand to Marshall, but she was too frightened to accept his help, even though she knew he was there to protect her. Unvain understood her fear, recognizing the trauma she had experienced, and turned to face the bandits, ready to defend the noblewomen. Marshall was confused about how Unvain had appeared out of nowhere and was now fighting off the bandits alone. She wanted to help him, but Valerie stopped her, expressing concern. Marshall didn't want Unvain to get hurt, but Valerie argued that it would be better for Unvain to be hurt than for Marshall to put herself in danger. Valerie was clearly worried about Marshall's well-being, looking at her with concern. She urged Marshall to stay put, reminding her that she was a fragile noblewoman who shouldn't be on the battlefield. Marshall, understanding that she would only be a hindrance if she went, reluctantly stayed back. It wasn't long before Tamex arrived with his army, taking control of the situation. During the chaos, Marshall remained seated, watching the fight unfold around her. Tamex noticed her distressed face and approached, offering her a hand to help her stand. She was about to speak, but Tamex silenced her, telling her they could talk later. A man was assigned to escort the noblewomen, and Valerie, relieved to see that Marshall was safe, ran to hug her. She scolded Marshall for her reckless behavior, expressing how worried she had been for her safety. Marshall, feeling guilty for making Valerie anxious, listened quietly. Valerie then questioned why Marshall had called for Tamex's help, but Marshall had no answer, feeling even more uncertain about the situation. She realized that she was trapped, unsure of what to do, and ran to find Sir Unvain. She couldn't understand why she felt the need to speak with him. As she was running, she suddenly felt a sharp pain in her ankle. Unvain noticed her distress and asked if she was injured. Marshall, feeling awkward, apologized for her earlier behavior. Unvain offered his hand, but Marshall hesitated and avoided it, feeling rude for rejecting his kindness. Unvain, understanding that it was a reflexive reaction to the shock, wasn't upset. Marshall, still feeling guilty about her inability to help during the fight, could only watch helplessly. Unvain assured her that as long as she wasn't afraid of him, he was fine. He then removed his jacket and gave it to her, lifting her up gently. Marshall, unsure of his intentions, wondered why she had run to him after calling for someone else's help. There was something unusual about the situation for Tamex. Unvain had taken Marshall in his arms, thinking she was seriously injured and in need of a doctor. Tamex said nothing, although he seemed troubled by the actions. Marshall, feeling fine, asked Unvain to put her down, but he insisted on carrying her. Tamex didn't seem pleased by this, and his discomfort was evident. Unvain carried her back to the palace, where the maid was shocked to see him holding Marshall. As Unvain continued walking toward her room, everyone who saw them was visibly surprised. Even her father and mother grew worried when they saw her being carried. Unvain gently laid Marshall on her bed. Soon, her father, mother, and Brandon rushed into her room, and at that moment the doctor was attending to Marshall. The Countess, seeing Marshall, nearly fainted from shock. Marshall, concerned about the Countess's reaction, felt a sharp pain in her hands. Just as she was about to collapse, Unvain caught her. Brandon, noticing the scene, hurried over to Marshall, but Unvain stepped back, removing his hand from her. Brandon, furious, demanded to know what had happened to his sister. The Countess, equally worried, insisted on knowing what had occurred. The tension was palpable, and everyone seemed to be suspicious of Unvain. Marshall tried to explain the situation, but finally, Unvain spoke up, telling them that Marshall had been attacked by armed men on her way home. The bandits had planned to sell them, but Duke Ludvillian had intervened and saved them. Brandon, now deeply concerned, listened intently. The Countess, still worried, asked about Valerie as well. Unvain reassured them that Valerie was fine and had been coming with the Duke, but he had taken Marshall first due to her injuries. The Countess, relieved, rushed to Marshall's side, apologizing for being more concerned about Valerie, as she had not seen Marshall with her. She expressed her concern for Marshall's well-being, though Marshall reassured her that she only had minor bruises and shouldn't worry too much. Marshall understood that the Countess didn't need to apologize, as it was natural for a mother to be more concerned about her children, especially Valerie. Marshall wasn't jealous of Valerie's safety, knowing her mother's worry was out of love. The doctor advised Marshall to rest, but no one knew when the Duke would return. Though tired, Marshall's sleep was disturbed when her father began to suspect how the Duke had learned about the incident. The Count believed that his daughter had been kidnapped, yet Duke Tamex acted so quickly to intervene. He began to suspect that it was all part of a trap set by the Duke. Marshall, realizing the trouble she was in, grew more anxious. Brandon, shocked by his father's accusations, argued that their family had lived in the capital for generations without any issues, and no one would dare to do such a thing. Yet the girls had been kidnapped in broad daylight. Marshall felt more anxious as her father continued to suspect Duke Tamex of orchestrating the kidnapping and using them as bait. Brandon tried to calm his father, but the Count refused to listen, his suspicions only growing. Marshall knew no one would believe her when she explained that she had been knocked out and had no control over the situation, especially regarding the teddy bear. Even Unvain began to have doubts. He couldn't understand how he had been able to discover the kidnapping so quickly, or how he had located them so easily. Even more troubling, he questioned how Marshall had known Tamex was coming to save her. Marshall, now certain she had walked into a trap, remembered screaming for Tamex in her moment of distress. Unvain suspected that they had planned the whole thing together. Though he apologized for accusing her wrongly, he couldn't shake the reckless thought that Marshall had only called for Tamex's help. Marshall tried to explain the situation to him, but Unvain believed his family would take her side and prepared to leave. Marshall became frustrated, realizing that despite his words, Unvain didn't truly believe her. She knew that both she and Tamex were now in serious trouble. Marshall sat in Tamex's bedroom, waiting for him, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the thought of how Unvain had accused her of being involved in the kidnapping with Tamex. She remembered how the bandits, too, had come from the north. Earlier, as Unvain had left her room, he had warned her to be prepared for questions, as the situation was dire. He told her that the questions would be tricky and that she would need to comply. Marshall had been taken aback by Unvain's words, feeling confused, as no one seemed to understand what he was talking about. Meanwhile, Tamex returned to his room, holding the burned teddy bear. Marshall called out for him, but he didn't hear her. She rushed toward him, but Tamex slammed his hand on the table, his anger clear. Marshall could feel his frustration and understood that he was upset because she had run away and burned his teddy bear. The misunderstanding seemed to be growing, and Marshall was at a loss for how to fix it. She thought that perhaps it was because Tamex had asked her to trust him, but she had done things her own way instead. Maybe it was because she had left without saying anything when he had saved her. Or maybe it was because the teddy bear, which was important to him, had been ruined, even though she hadn't been the one to burn it. Tamex began removing his clothes, and Marshall couldn't help but feel a sense of déjà vu. She had seen him like this before, but this time, she wasn't sure how to explain herself. She wanted to tell him what had happened, but with the teddy bear destroyed, she didn't know how. She couldn't go back to her own body now, as it would only lead to more questions from the Countess. She was sure that there would be no excuse to visit Tamex, and she couldn't risk that. She realized that she only had one way left to communicate with him. Tamex sat down, his eyes on the sacred item, which was now the only thing left. He remembered the battle earlier, when Sir Unvain had been cutting down the bandits without hesitation, even though some of them were his own men. He realized that the bandits, who had been wanted criminals, had actually hoped to be executed by Tamex. As he thought about the bandits, he wondered if they were from the north, and whether they might remember Unvain, or if they simply didn't care about him. The bandits had been furious over their treaty, still believing that they couldn't stop the war, even if it was just temporary. Tamex knew that these bandits had been soldiers of the imperial palace, but they hadn't recognized Unvain. As he stared at the sacred item, he was shocked, deep in thought, when a voice suddenly came from the window. He walked over and opened it. Marshall, sounding terribly sorry, admitted that she had possessed the teddy bear and apologized for what had happened. She explained that she had chosen a safer option this time, knowing things could go badly. However, she would prepare smaller animals in the future to help her escape if needed. Marshall arrived and apologized to Tamex, who immediately recognized him. This time, Tamex appeared in the form of a sparrow. She bowed to him, despite the small limbs of her sparrow body, explaining that her bow should be considered a sign of respect. Although Marshall didn't want it, he sat down and asked her to explain everything, why she had possessed the bear and why she had approached him. Despite it being a long story, Tamex was prepared to share it. Though Marshall didn't seem as angry as before, Tamex could still sense his irritation, and Marshall was clearly scared by it. As Tamex began telling her story, she coughed, as she hadn't anticipated revealing so much. She explained that when she was 6 years old, she had fallen down the stairs and was unconscious for a month. Ever since then, whenever she went to sleep, her soul would leave her body. In this state, she could possess any human or animal body. This was a form of possession, but Marshall wondered if she could enter humans at will. She clarified that she couldn't just possess anyone she saw. She could only take control of someone who was either drunk or unconscious, people in a weakened state, and even then, they could reject her or force her out. Her possession would only last for 3 hours. From that moment on, whenever she slept, Tamex would wander, exploring the world as a spirit. One night, while she was roaming around the palace, she came across a book about living spirits, which she said came from a wicked priest's text. Tamex admitted she hadn't liked coming into Marshall's room without permission that day. Though she knew it was her fault, she didn't realize it was his room. She had assumed it was empty when she came down from her own room above his and found his bag on the bed. Tamex explained that she didn't intend to possess the bear, but somehow, she had ended up in it. Ever since, when she went to sleep, she would wake up as a teddy bear and couldn't escape, though she could hear strange voices. She felt something was off about the bear. Marshall, puzzled, asked why she called the bear Belle. Tamex explained that it was the name of his little sister, which made Marshall pause. After a long silence, Marshall shared a memory with her, though he doubted she would believe him. He had spent 10 years on the battlefield, starting at the age of 18. During one mission, he had been severely wounded, stabbed in the side while protecting his superiors, and nearly died. He had been bedridden for 3 days without adequate medicine. On the 3rd day, he felt someone touch his head, and the pain slowly faded with each touch. When he woke up, he saw his sister Belle, though it was impossible for her to be there. Tamex was sure it had been Belle's spirit. Marshall explained that he wasn't frightened by her, even though he had thought Belle was there to take him with her. The next day, he felt his recovery speed up, and he woke to find the teddy bear in his arms. He had thought that Belle's soul might be inside it. Marshall admitted he shouldn't have asked Tamex about these matters, but she didn't seem to mind. Tamex acknowledged that Marshall never wanted to be in the teddy bear. Marshall wondered if he actually believed her. Tamex, having worked with many spies during the war, could usually tell when someone was lying. She assured him that she wasn't making up her story. She had pretended to be an ordinary doll for her own safety, but now that she had revealed herself, she had been nothing but polite to him. This was because the bear was his companion, and he had had it for almost 10 years. Marshall sighed, saying that now that Tamex knew who he was, she must realize he was just an unpleasant girl with a scary face. She couldn't possibly continue being rude to him, could she? Tamex responded that, while the bear might have a complicated backstory, no 28-year-old man would call a teddy bear his friend. Marshall, slightly embarrassed, explained that he didn't have many friends and had probably misunderstood. He winced, and Tamex, unbothered, remarked that despite the bear being a gift from his sister, it was still unpleasant to see a talking, moving teddy bear. Marshall apologized, acknowledging that he understood Tamex's frustration, but that she was tormenting a small animal. Tamex, smiling slightly, admitted that when Marshall had cried, it had been quite funny. She further explained that her friendliness toward him had nothing to do with her sister, but rather because she enjoyed the way he spoke and his company. Both Valerie and Marshall came there. His Majesty was waiting for both of them. Valerie was ready to handle everything on her own, but Marshall wanted to testify. The gates got opened, everyone was present. Queen Sasha, Sir Unvian, and Tamex. Sir Unvian was carefully watching her. Marshall knew they were there only to testify, but still the atmosphere was a bit unusual. Tamex stated that he was chasing after a suspected man when a servant reported him of kidnapping and he took action immediately. Majesty was again and again asking about the servant and how he knew about kidnapping. Marshall didn't understood why they were interrogating him. Maybe the king thought it was Tamex who kidnapped them because he acted first. He was again in trouble because of her. Majesty don't understand how servants knew about kidnapping when they were not on patrol around capital. But Tamex chose to remain silent, and Marshall sought permission from Majesty to speak in there. Valerie got worried about her actions. Majesty allowed her to speak as she was involved into that matter. She had no choice but to lie everything, as her truth was far beyond to be true. Marshall blamed herself for the involvement of Tamex. Valerie, Unvian, and Sachet all were confused. Marshall was the one called for his help. She was not good feeling because of the night she hit that person with plate, and she wanted to return home as soon as possible. But she had already caused a lot of trouble for Tamex, so she wanted to say a goodbye at least to him. So she asked him to meet her at the southern gate. She had no clue that Lafey Valerie would come along with her, so she had to leave right away. And she knew Tamex would investigate again if she fails to there. But Majesty didn't understood why she didn't went along with her sister Valerie. Even in short time, she came up with an excuse for this as well. She explained that she was not an legitimate child of Lydian's family. She was exposing her weakness so they'll believe her. The Lydians has always been treated her without discrimination. But that doesn't changes, she's an illegitimate child. Valerie had no clue why Marshall was saying such words. She called Tamex without thinking, but later she realized that if they seen together, that will create more of a scandal and tarnish Lydian's family name. She didn't wanted to cause more troubling to her family since after that party. She was been a subject of scandals and rumors, and she didn't wanted same to happen with Valerie. Majesty understood her. He understood that she was just saving her family name, but should have informed her father at least. Marshall was shocked that she convinced the Majesty there. Marshall explained that she was reckless of thinking and caused misunderstanding. She apologized, but Majesty didn't wanted her to apologize as she was victim. But Majesty was angry with Tamex that he tried to fool Majesty. As Majesty was expecting much better from Duke, even he apologized to Majesty as well. Everyone left, and Duke turned around as he was angry, but Marshall said not to thank her. He didn't understood why. But he has always been protected her. So this time Marshall wanted to save him. Tamex didn't understood why she was calling him by his name, but Marshall liked it calling him Tamex. Tamex regretted for saying such things to her day before, but he can't take back what he said. Tamex had come to enjoy Marshall's company. Although he initially considered her an unusual person, his feelings began to shift after seeing her in the garden. When he told her not to show him her face, he knew his words wouldn't make sense. But her face reminded him so much of the bear. So, when she later revealed she was the bear, he wasn't very surprised at first. Marshall understood that Tamex already knew about her, but seeing her that day made him realize she was simply being herself, the same way she had been in the bear. Though they hadn't known each other for long, Tamex began to see her as a younger sibling. He harbored no hatred toward Marshall. In fact, he felt bad seeing her so discouraged. Others might have thought he was out of his mind, but Tamex's feelings were genuine. He saw Marshall as something like family and had grown attached to him. Marshall felt relieved that she wasn't the only one who felt this way. Marshall, too, had come to enjoy Tamex's company. All the while, she had been waiting for him to make his feelings known, but he never got angry with her. Secretly, she longed for him to see her true self. Tamex took it upon himself to explain that she shouldn't get too excited too quickly. First, she had attacked that man, and then she had tried to fight with the kidnappers. She had acted recklessly, and Marshall agreed with Tamex's assessment. Despite scolding her, Marshall felt shy, as no one had ever reprimanded her like that before. Even in that moment, she was smiling, and that made her happy. Tamex had always looked out for her, and now he turned around reflecting that he should have at least been told that she was a woman, so he wouldn't have made her sleep in the same bed as him. This concern arose because Marshall knew that Tamex would never do anything inappropriate to her. Tamex himself questioned why anyone would do such a thing to a bear. Marshall knew it was true. Even though Tamex looked intimidating, he was a good person, and Marshall liked him. Tamex was shocked by her words, unable to believe that she thought so highly of him. She was hoping that he would take care of her as he did Marshall Lydian's. Tamex had had enough. He didn't understand who had given her the name Ice Rose. At that moment, he realized that dealing with the teddy bear was easier than dealing with Marshall. Suddenly, Tamex stopped talking, and Marshall wondered what had happened. Just then, her parents entered the hall, with her father visibly angry. They were there to speak with Marshall. Tamex felt it was best to talk another time, as her father seemed upset and wanted to take her away from him. Marshall immediately realized that her father had misunderstood the situation. As they conversed, she wanted to do something, and Tamex advised her to visit him while she was asleep. He asked her not to wander around as a spirit, but to possess something and visit him instead. She was happy to see him again that night. Meanwhile, Unvian and Sasha were both wondering about the bandits. Princess Sasha questioned everyone who had helped her reach the palace, but no one seemed to know who was behind it. However, Unvian suspected that the bandits knew their tactics well. The Duke arrived, and Unvian informed him that the men weren't his. The Duke had already suspected this, as the way the bandits spoke imperial language suggested they were not deserters. Their attack hadn't just been a kidnapping attempt. It was also meant to frame the northern troops. Unvian and the Duke both knew that someone else was behind the bandits. Marshall and her father were walking together. Although Marshall had managed to convince the Majesty, her father was still angry about something. She tried to speak with him, but he didn't want her apology. He told her that she was a good daughter, and he understood she must have had her reasons. However, he wanted her to promise that she wouldn't put herself in such situations again and that she would have no further contact with Duke. As a father, he trusted his daughter, but not the man who had made her lie. He had understood that it was all a lie. As her father, he expected at least a promise from her. Marshall was apologetic, but couldn't promise to never meet Duke again. She didn't want to stay away from him. She tried to explain to her father that Duke would never hurt her. Valerie remained calm, and her father eventually agreed that Marshall could do what she wanted, but he banned her from going out once they reached home. The doctor had treated Marshall's wounds, but she couldn't stop thinking about her father's words. He had told her not to meet Duke Lydiance again, and it weighed heavily on her. She felt sad, but she knew that Duke would wait for her. Lost in her thoughts, she didn't even hear Valerie calling her. The treatment was finished, and the Countess was still explaining the situation to the other noblewomen as they were planning to leave the palace in the evening. Valerie told Marshall to rest, but Marshall noticed something off about Valerie. She wondered if Valerie was angry with her, but it turned out she wasn't. Finally, Valerie asked Marshall about her relationship with Duke and why she seemed so desperate to meet him. Marshall explained that Duke had helped her, and she wanted to thank him. Valerie suddenly became excited and realized she had asked the wrong question, causing a scene. Marshall noticed that Valerie had been talking a lot about Tamex. Perhaps she was serious about him. Brandon, who had met Tamex during training, mentioned that Tamex had always been scrupulous but never acted like a superior. He valued the lives of his men and avoided unnecessary combat. Brandon and Marshall were both shocked by this. They remembered that Brandon had once been an aspiring knight, and they wondered if he had fought in battle. However, Brandon was no longer a knight, and Marshall suggested he choose another profession. She explained that wars were dangerous and people were afraid of them. If Brandon didn't want to be a knight, he could choose another path. Brandon was shocked, as those words were exactly what Tamex had told him. Marshall laughed, realizing she had just repeated Tamex's words without knowing it. That night, Marshall slept and possessed a bird again. She saw that Tamex's windows were open and planned to surprise him. However, Tamex caught her before she could. He caught her because she had sneaked in without telling him. She just wanted to say hello. Tamex was packing his clothes, and Marshall wondered if he had lost a button or something. After taking her medicine, which was strong, she told Tamex that everyone was getting ready to leave, and they would depart in the evening. Tamex understood that she had no reason to stay at the palace anymore. Marshall wanted to know what he had wanted to tell her earlier, or if he planned to praise her for what she had done. Instead, he made her bend her legs and wings over her head. Marshall realized that it felt like punishment, and indeed, that's what Tamex was doing. She became angry because she had lied to Majesty and was scared at the time. Despite that, she gathered her courage and took a chance to save Tamex. However, Tamex was angry too because there was no proof, and if she hadn't defended herself, everyone would have moved on. He was worried about how Majesty would react. Marshall didn't understand the problem and asked why Tamex was upset. Tamex explained that the more well-crafted a story was, the more it became a lie. He told her that her baseless story was nothing but a lie to Majesty. She had tried to fool the Emperor, and he couldn't understand how she had thought she could do that. Marshall only wanted to help Tamex, but she now understood that her father had been able to see through the situation too, and perhaps Majesty had been playing along as well. She remembered what Unvian had said earlier about the plan with Tamex. Marshall began to realize why her father wanted her to stay away from him. It was because of her excuses. She started crying, feeling that everything had been ruined because of her actions. Marshall felt like an idiot because of the foolish act she had done to fool the Emperor, and it made Tamex even angrier. She had tried to cheer him up but only ended up making him sad. Marshall remembered how Tamex found her crying face funny, so she decided to start crying right there, though she wondered if birds could even cry. She worried that her tears might only make Tamex angrier, but she decided to give it a try. She cried and apologized, calling herself a fool and useless. Tamex noticed her tears and didn't want her to cry over it. He assured her that he was fine with what she had done for him, and he didn't want her to feel bad about it. He did raise his tone a bit to make her understand that she shouldn't keep making the same mistake over and over. However, despite his frustration, her actions made him feel a little happy. He was glad that she had stood up for him. Marshall stopped crying and looked at him with sparkling eyes, realizing that no one else would have dared to defend Tamex in the same way. It wasn't just empty words. No one had ever helped Tamex with good intentions before. It was a new experience for him, and Marshall was amazed. Despite this, Tamex didn't want her to repeat the same mistake. Marshall hadn't expected such an expression from him, but it was a beautiful one. Suddenly, the priest entered the room without knocking, startling Marshall. Tamex scolded him for not knocking before entering, and the priest noticed the bird in Tamex's hands. Marshall was frightened by the priest, but then she noticed that he was holding something. The priest was hiding a teddy bear, which he had brought to try to make Marshall feel better. He hadn't known that Marshall was already there in bird form. Upon seeing the bear, Marshall suddenly became angry, thinking that the teddy bear was haunted. The priest recognized Marshall in the bird's body and explained that the teddy bear was made by his mother. His family had a business making and selling teddy bears, but their family name had been forgotten. Marshall was surprised to learn that the priest came from a noble family, even though it was no longer known. She apologized to him for her actions, but the priest explained that the bears were sold to merchants, and all the bears looked the same. Marshall thought that maybe she could have bought one in the market, but the priest's family no longer owned the business, so they were impossible to find. His mother had made 15 dolls identical to the bear, one of which was given to Tamex's sister. Marshall recalled having seen the same doll before and wondered if she had received one too. However, she had no memory of ever owning one. The bear was brand new and had been stored in the priest's home storeroom. The priest thought that Marshall might want the doll because she looked like a bear. At that moment, Marshall bit her finger, and the priest quickly apologized. Marshall questioned why he was apologizing to her, wondering what he felt sorry for. The priest explained that he was sorry for what had happened to her when she had been in the doll's body. He felt bad about her experience and explained that Tamex's safety had always been his priority. The priest then added that because of what had happened, Marshall had to experience terrifying things, such as her face now looking like a mess. He said her cheeks were swollen like a dog stung by a bee, and he felt bad for that. He apologized for it. Marshall was shocked that this was his idea of an apology. Meanwhile, Tamex struggled to hold in his laughter. He made an excuse to leave and prepare some tea, but Marshall quickly realized that this was part of the prank, with Tamex involved in it too. The priest remarked that Marshall had managed to get away with pretending to be a bear, but he now knew her true identity, and she was still as rude as ever, claiming that it was no way to address a priest. Marshall asked him what his problem was, and teasingly suggested some alternatives like calling her arsoniat, murder, or just a jerk. She then questioned how long it had been since he became a priest. The priest explained that Tamex had joined the army shortly after he was baptized, which meant he had been around 16 or 17 years old at the time. Marshall then asked about the temple, wondering if it was nice. The priest admitted it wasn't a noble mansion but mentioned that one could learn to adjust. Marshall continued, asking if working as a volunteer in the temple would be doable. The priest asked her why she was suddenly asking these questions, and Tamex chimed in, wondering if Marshall was planning to join the temple as well. Marshall confirmed that she intended to join once Valerie got married. Tamex seemed surprised, questioning why she was interested in the temple as she didn't seem religious. Marshall asked if she needed a reason. Tamex then suggested that the life at the temple might not be suitable for her, particularly because of her scary face. The priest, hearing this, questioned if Marshall remembered what Tamex had said. Marshall explained that she was not a fool, and that it hadn't been long since Tamex had made such a comment. The priest retorted that Tamex had said the same thing, and Marshall pointed out that Tamex got a pass, as she had been nervous thinking he would kill her when they first met. Tamex was surprised, asking if he had scared her that much. Marshall laughed it off, saying that as a soldier and a duke, the more stern he looked, the better. She added that everyone spoke about how handsome he was, including her brother Brandon, who also said that Tamex was a good guy. Tamex quickly interrupted, saying he wasn't asking for compliments. He admitted that he had left a strong impression on her, even without realizing it, and he needed to reflect on how he came across. But he quickly changed the subject, asking why she wished to join the temple. Marshall, feeling a bit evasive, wondered if she should tell him the real reason. She brought up the fact that Tamex had accused her of being a spy and placing a curse on him, and asked about the evil-looking objects she had seen. She demanded an explanation for what had happened. The priest seemed taken aback by her boldness, and Marshall pointed out that he couldn't answer her questions, but kept asking her to explain things. Tamex stepped in, explaining that as soon as Marshall had fallen asleep, he began investigating the room. He found a secret space above the ceiling and climbed up, discovering several pagan ritual objects, including burnt candles, animal bones, and letters written in blood. There were all sorts of wicked things, and while Tamex didn't believe in curses, he was sure someone had done this out of spite. Marshall had no recollection of anything like that on her first day. Tamex then revealed that he had found poison in the glass he had been using. Marshall was shocked and asked if he was all right. Tamex reassured her that he was fine, though he hadn't reported it to the Emperor yet. He also admitted that he had tried to track down the culprit himself, but had failed. The only link to the poison was the moving bear, which led him to wrongly accuse Marshall. He apologized for his mistake. Marshall, still stunned by the mention of poison in the palace, asked the priest if he had known about the secret space. The priest was surprised to learn that Marshall had known, but she explained that she had seen it when she came down from the upper floor. The priest was astonished, and jokingly asked if she could go through walls. Marshall quipped that it would be even scarier if she could open doors, which amused the priest. He asked what a spirit looked like, and Marshall explained that she looked the same as her human form, though she couldn't touch anything but could fly around as she pleased. She also added that people would get scared when they came into contact with a spirit. The priest agreed that it was frightening and turned to Tamex asking if he agreed. Tamex, however, thought it was useful information. He said that if he ever sensed an unpleasant gaze, he would search the room, and if something felt off, it would likely mean Marshall was involved. Marshall rolled her eyes, feeling exasperated that Tamex was still treating everything like a mystery. Tamex then asked again why she wanted to leave a life of service, pressing her for an answer. Marshall, realizing how persistent he was, finally spoke up, explaining that she had lost many things due to the temple, her sister, her friends, and that all she had received were empty blessings. Living in the temple felt suffocating to her, as she couldn't go outside, marry, or have children. It was like being in a birdcage. Tamex seemed to understand, but he asked why she didn't consider living on her own instead. He suggested that she could make her own money, since she came from a distinguished family, and maybe even become a teacher or an artist. Marshall sighed, saying she couldn't see, let alone paint, and no one would want her to be a teacher. The priest then reminded her that living in the temple meant giving up her status, and he warned her that the place was run down. He explained that if his family had been doing well, he wouldn't have chosen this life. The food there was terrible, and he wasn't even allowed to drink wine. Marshall, though, sighed inwardly, thinking that if there were another way, she might have considered it, but it seemed pointless. She noticed it was getting late. The priest added that the high priest was always nagging, but Marshall, feeling the pressure, said she had to go. Tamex protested, asking her to wait, but Marshall explained that they were supposed to leave that evening. If she didn't hurry, everyone would be worried about her. She promised she would see Tamex again sometime soon. Tamex, still puzzled, asked when that would be, and Marshall simply told him later sometime soon before saying goodbye.